Rejected Omega begged the Alpha King for protection from a mate, and he stood to defend. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character, Elena Hart. Elena stood at the far edge of the grand hall, where the torchlight faded into shadow and the polished stone floor felt colder beneath her worn shoes. Her hands folded tightly at her waist, as if holding herself together required constant effort. Her breathing measured, quiet, practiced after years of learning how not to draw attention, because attention had always come with consequences, and tonight was no different. The council chamber filled with voices she tried not to hear, laughter that wasn't meant for her, confidence that had never been hers to claim, and somewhere behind her she could feel it, the presence she feared most, not through touch or sound, but through memory, the weight of a bond that had once been forced on her and never truly released. A mate who believed claiming meant ownership, who believed rejection was a challenge rather than an answer, and Elena knew that if she turned around, if she met his eyes, the night would spiral in ways she might not survive. Emotionally, so she kept her gaze low, focusing instead on the raised dais at the center of the hall, where Alpha King Dominic Blackwood sat in quiet authority, his posture calm, unreadable, the kind of stillness that commanded the room without a single word. And Elena wondered, not for the first time, how someone could exist with that much certainty while she felt like every step she took might shatter the ground beneath her. The gathering continued, formal voices rising and falling, rules discussed, alliances weighed. But none of it reached her fully because her heartbeat had begun to count time for her, steady but loud in her ears, each beat reminding her that she had come here with only one purpose, one last hope. And no guarantee she would be heard, she remembered. The warnings whispered by others like her, Omegas who had learned the hard way that kings did not involve themselves in personal disputes, that survival meant staying silent, accepting what you were given, enduring. But Elena had already endured too much. She had spent years being careful, years choosing peace over safety, years believing that if she stayed small, the storm would pass her by, and it never had. Instead it followed. Closer each time, until tonight, when escape was no longer an option. A subtle movement behind her made her shoulders tense, a familiar presence closing in, confident, entitled, and Elena felt the old fear rise, sharp but controlled, because fear had taught her how to be brave when nothing else would. She took a slow breath, lifted her head, and stepped forward into the light, every eye in the hall turning as she crossed the distance she had always tried to keep. Her voice unsteady but clear when she finally spoke, not loud, not dramatic, simply honest. As she lowered herself before the throne, the stone cool against her knees, her words carrying across the silence that followed, a plea not for power or revenge, but for something far simpler, something she had never truly known, protection. And in that moment, before anyone reacted, before judgment fell, Elena Hart waited, unsure whether the most powerful man in the realm would look past her title, past her fear, and see the truth of why she had come. The silence that followed Elena's plea stretched longer than she expected, long enough for old memories to rise uninvited, memories of a life shaped by decisions she never truly consented to, of being told that fate had spoken when all she had felt was fear, years ago when the bond had been announced, when Ryan Cole's name had been tied to hers before she understood what that meant, before she knew how easily words like mate could be used to cage instead of protect. She remembered standing in a smaller hall back then, barely 19, her palms sweating as elders spoke of tradition and balance, of how some bonds were chosen by the moon and others by necessity, and how her quiet protests had been dismissed as nerves, as weakness, as something she would outgrow, but she never did. Because what followed was not partnership but pressure, not safety but expectation. Ryan had always smiled in public, always spoken of duty and order, but behind closed doors his certainty left no room for her voice. Every disagreement framed as disobedience, every hesitation as ingratitude, and when she finally found the courage to step away, to reject what was destroying her sense of self. The pack had turned cold, as if survival itself were a betrayal. She became the rejected Omega not because she lacked worth, but because she refused to surrender it. Standing now before the Alpha King, Elena felt that history pressing against her spine. The weight of knowing that if Dominic Blackwood chose not to intervene, there would be no appeal, no higher authority to shield her from a bond that still reached for her like a shadow. She could sense Ryan somewhere behind her, his presence steady, confident, as though the outcome were already decided, and that certainty terrified her more than any raised voice ever had, because it meant he believed the world would side with him. Elena swallowed, keeping her gaze forward, aware of how small she must look in the vastness of the chamber, how easily she could be overlooked. Yet she had come this far because silence had never protected her before. Around her the council members shifted, murmurs rippling through the hall as they considered not just her plea but the implications of it. An Omega asking a king to intervene in a bond dispute was rare, dangerous, and Elena knew that some saw her as disruptive, inconvenient, but she also knew that survival was worth being inconvenient. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the effort of standing in her truth without apology. She thought of the years she spent minimizing herself, choosing careful words, choosing compliance, choosing peace that was never really peace. And she realized that kneeling here was not submission. It was the opposite. It was a declaration that she deserved safety even if she had to ask for it out loud. Her breath steadied as she waited, listening to the faint crackle of torches, the distant sound of the hall settling, and somewhere above it all, the quiet presence of the Alpha King. She could feel his attention now, not as pressure but as focus, and that alone sent a strange warmth through her chest. Not hope exactly, but the fragile possibility of it. Elena did not know what Dominic Blackwood would decide. She did not know if he believed in her words or in the system that had failed her. But for the first time since she had been bound to a fate she never chose, she felt seen. And as she remained there, steady despite her fear, Elena understood something clearly. Whatever happened next would change her life, because she had finally stepped into the light and refused to disappear again. Elena remained where she knelt, the cool stones steady beneath her, while the atmosphere in the hall subtly shifted, not loud or dramatic, but unmistakable, as if the space itself were paying closer attention. She could feel Ryan's confidence sharpen behind her, his presence edging nearer, not enough to touch, but enough to remind her that he believed proximity alone gave him authority. And it took all her restraint not to flinch, because fear had taught her how to survive, but it had also taught her how easily others mistook silence for consent. She focused instead on the raised dais, on Alpha King Dominic Blackwood, whose gaze now rested fully on her, not with judgment, but with measured consideration, the kind that weighed truth rather than appearances. And Elena wondered if he could sense the quiet urgency beneath her stillness, the way every muscle in her body was braced not for conflict but for endurance. Voices began to murmur again, low and controlled, council members exchanging looks, some skeptical, others uneasy, because what Elena had done challenged something older than law. It challenged the assumption that power alone determined worth. Ryan finally spoke, his voice calm, practiced, carrying just far enough to sound reasonable. He addressed the council first, then the king, explaining the bond in terms of tradition and order, presenting himself as patient, concerned, a mate who had been misunderstood rather than refused. Elena listened without turning, because she had heard this version of him before, the one that left out the nights of quiet pressure, the constant reminders of obligation, the way choice had slowly been replaced by expectation. She felt her throat tighten, but kept her breathing even, reminding herself that truth did not need volume to exist. Dominic Blackwood did not interrupt, did not react outwardly. And that silence unsettled Ryan more than argument ever could. Elena sensed it in the slight change in the air, the way confidence hesitated when it was no longer mirrored. Time stretched again, measured not in seconds but in heartbeats, and Elena became acutely aware of how exposed she was, how easily this moment could turn against her. Yet she also felt something else, a steadiness growing where fear once lived, because regardless of the outcome, she had spoken, she had refused to disappear, and that mattered. The Alpha King finally shifted, not rising yet, but leaning forward slightly, his attention moving from Ryan to Elena and back again, as though assembling a fuller picture. When he spoke, his voice was calm, carrying without effort, and he asked questions not about possession or protocol, but about consent, about boundaries, about whether a bond maintained through fear could truly be considered sacred. The hall grew quieter with each word, because those were questions few in power bothered to ask. Elena lifted her head then, just enough to meet his gaze, and in that moment, she did not feel small. She felt grounded. Dominic acknowledged her with a subtle nod, not granting favor, but recognition, and that alone sent a ripple of relief through her chest. Ryan's response came quickly, defensive beneath the surface, invoking duty, invoking precedent, invoking the discomfort of change, and Elena realized that what frightened him was not losing her, but losing control of the narrative he had relied on. The king listened without interruption, then allowed silence to fall once more. Heavier now, charged with expectation, Elena waited, aware that everything balanced on what came next. She did not pray. She did not beg again. She simply remained present, trusting that the truth she carried was enough to stand on its own. And as Dominic Blackwood straightened in his seat, the subtle movement drawing every eye in the chamber, Elena felt the moment tipping, not yet resolved, but undeniably moving, like the first shift of a tide that could no longer be held back. Elena felt the moment crystallize around her, the air in the chamber growing dense with expectation as Alpha King Dominic Blackwood rose slowly from his seat, not abruptly, not in anger, but with a deliberate calm that commanded every gaze without effort. The sound of his boots against stone echoed once, and then faded. And in that quiet Elena understood that this was not a reaction, it was a decision. Dominic descended the steps of the dais with measured strides, each one closing the distance between authority and vulnerability, until he stood level with her, close enough that she could sense the steady strength in his presence. Not overwhelming, not threatening, simply there. He did not touch her, did not lift her chin or gesture for her to rise. Instead, he positioned himself slightly in front of her, an unmistakable shift that altered the balance of the room. And for the first time since she had entered the hall, Elena felt the space behind her grow still. Ryan's presence halted, his proximity checked not by force but by hierarchy. Dominic spoke then, his voice even, clear, carrying across the chamber with a controlled resonance that left no room for misinterpretation. He stated that no bond, regardless of tradition, granted the right to fear. That protection was not a privilege earned by dominance, but a responsibility owed by those with power. The words landed with quiet weight, each one deliberate, each one reshaping the narrative that had governed Elena's life for so long. He acknowledged Elena directly, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be heard, affirming that her request for protection had been made under his authority and would be honored as such. A murmur rippled through the council, restrained but unmistakable. Elena's chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the unfamiliar sensation of relief. Dominic then addressed Ryan, not accusing, not condemning, but firm, outlining boundaries with the clarity of law rather than emotion. He declared that until the bond dispute could be reviewed without coercion, Elena would stand under the Alpha King's protection, that any attempt to pressure, intimidate, or reclaim authority over her would be considered a violation of his direct order. The words were not raised, yet they carried absolute finality. Ryan's response faltered, his carefully maintained composure cracking just enough to reveal disbelief, because he had never imagined a scenario in which Elena's voice would outweigh his claim. Elena remained kneeling, her hands trembling now despite her efforts. But this time the tremor came from release, from the sudden absence of a threat she had carried like a second spine. Dominic turned back to her then, extending his hand not as command but as invitation, his gaze steady, respectful. And Elena hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, the contact brief and appropriate, grounding rather than intimate. He helped her rise, positioning her fully behind him now, a clear signal that her safety was no longer theoretical. The hall absorbed the image in silence, the rejected Omega no longer isolated, no longer exposed, but visibly shielded by the highest authority in the realm. Elena stood taller than she had entered, not because she felt powerful, but because she felt secure, Her breathing eased, her shoulders lowered, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that protection did not have to be begged for in whispers, that sometimes it arrived in the form of someone willing to stand between you and what had once controlled your fate. As Dominic Blackwood turned back toward the council, continuing proceedings with composed authority, Elena remained where she was, quietly absorbing the truth of what had just occurred, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, the world had shifted, and she would never again have to face it alone. The chamber did not return to normal after the Alpha King's declaration. Instead, it settled into a charged quiet that felt heavier than the earlier tension, as if everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted and was still deciding how to respond to it. Elena stood just behind Dominic Blackwood, aware of how different the world looked from this position. The same hall, the same faces. Yet everything felt altered by the simple fact that she was no longer standing alone. The council resumed its formal posture, voices measured, movements careful. But Elena could sense the undercurrent beneath their restraint, questions forming, loyalties recalibrating, some watching her with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval, because protection from a king carried implications that extended far beyond a single dispute. Dominic continued to address procedural matters with calm authority, outlining the steps that would follow: an independent review, witnesses heard, time given for emotions to cool rather than escalate. His approach was methodical, designed to restore order without erasing what had just been acknowledged. And Elena realized that this too was a form of protection, not just standing in front of her, but reshaping the rules so that her safety was not temporary or conditional. Ryan remained silent now, his earlier confidence replaced by a rigid stillness. He kept his distance, not out of choice but necessity, and Elena felt the strange mix of relief and sadness that came with seeing someone who once held power over her reduced to irrelevance by his own unwillingness to listen. She did not feel victorious, only lighter, as though a weight she had carried for years had finally been set down. Time passed in subtle increments, measured by the rhythm of voices and the scratch of quills, and Elena's breathing slowly returned to normal, her body releasing tension she had learned to live with. She became aware of small details again: the warmth of the torches, the faint scent of stone and smoke, the steady presence at her side. Dominic did not speak to her directly during the proceedings, but his awareness never left her, a quiet assurance that she did not need to be vigilant anymore. When the council session finally drew toward its close, Dominic addressed the room one last time, reaffirming that his protection extended beyond the walls of the chamber, that Elena Hart would be granted safe residence within the central keep until the matter was resolved. The announcement sent another ripple through the hall, because it elevated her status in a way no one had anticipated. Elena's heart skipped. The idea of staying within the Alpha King's domain felt unreal, almost overwhelming. Yet she did not protest. She understood now that accepting protection was not weakness, it was survival. As the assembly began to disperse, the formality breaking into quiet conversation, Elena remained where she was until Dominic turned to her, his voice lowered, respectful, informing her that arrangements would be made, that she would not be required to navigate the aftermath alone. She nodded, gratitude tightening her throat, but she managed a steady response, thanking him not with effusive emotion but with sincerity, because anything more would have felt performative. Dominic inclined his head, acknowledging her without claiming credit, and that restraint meant more to her than any dramatic gesture. Guards approached at a respectful distance, prepared to escort her, and Elena took one last look at the chamber, at the place where fear had nearly silenced her, and where she had instead found her voice. As she stepped forward, following the path laid out before her, she understood that the danger was not entirely gone, that challenges still waited beyond these walls. But for the first time she felt equipped to face them. Not because she had become stronger overnight, but because someone with true power had chosen to stand beside her. And in that choice, Elena Hart felt the quiet beginning of a future she had never dared to imagine. The corridors of the central keep felt quieter than Elena expected, not empty, but calm in a way she had never experienced before, each step echoing softly as she followed the assigned path, escorted at a respectful distance, the stone walls catching the glow of lantern light, and softening it into warmth rather than intimidation. She noticed how her shoulders no longer brushed inward, how her breath moved more freely through her chest, as if her body was slowly learning that it did not need to remain braced for harm. Dominic Blackwood walked several paces ahead, not rushing, not lingering, his presence steady and unassuming, and Elena realized that this too was intentional. He was not leading her like an order, nor leaving her to trail behind alone, but setting a pace that allowed her to remain grounded. As they reached a quieter wing of the keep, Dominic finally spoke, his tone measured, informing her that the chambers prepared for her were secure and private, that no one would enter without her consent. The word consent landed gently but firmly, and Elena felt its meaning settle deeper than she expected, because it had been so long since anyone with authority had spoken it to her as a promise rather than a condition. She thanked him again, her voice calm now, more certain, and Dominic acknowledged it with a nod, reminding her that accepting protection did not obligate her to anything beyond her own comfort and safety, that she retained agency in all matters. Concerning her future, the reassurance was not dramatic, but it was thorough, and Elena understood that this was how real power functioned, not through fear or display, but through clarity. When she reached the door to her temporary residence, she paused, hand resting lightly against the carved wood, feeling the quiet solidity of it. Dominic stopped a respectful distance away, giving her space even now, and told her that he would remain available should she require anything, that arrangements for the review process would begin in the morning, and that tonight she was free to rest, free to exist without expectation. Elena nodded, a small smile touching her lips despite the weight of the day, as she entered the room, the door closing softly behind her. The space inside was simple but welcoming, clean lines, a wide window overlooking the inner courtyard, a sense of order without austerity. She set her hands against the windowsill and looked out, watching the torchlight flicker below, reflecting on how quickly everything had changed, not because she had been rescued, but because she had been believed. The realization settled slowly, bringing with it a quiet strength. She was no longer defined by the bond that had tried to claim her, nor by the label of rejection that had followed her for years. She was Elena Hart, under the protection of the Alpha King, but more importantly, under her own. Later, as night deepened, she prepared for rest, moving through the unfamiliar room with growing ease, and for the first time in a long while, she did not listen for footsteps or raised voices. The silence felt safe, intentional. She lay down and allowed her eyes to close without fear, knowing that whatever challenges awaited her tomorrow, she would face them from a place of stability rather than survival. And elsewhere within the keep, Dominic Blackwood stood at his own window, gaze fixed on the same courtyard from a different angle, reflecting not on politics or protocol, but on the Omega who had knelt before him without demanding anything beyond the right to feel safe. He recognized the quiet courage it took to ask for help in a world that punished vulnerability, and he understood that his choice today would ripple outward, reshaping expectations, challenging assumptions. But as he turned away from the window, Dominic felt certain of one thing. Protecting Elena Hart had not been an act of defiance. It had been an act of leadership, and that distinction would matter in the days to come. Morning arrived softly within the keep, light filtering through tall windows and settling across stone floors with a calm certainty that mirrored how Elena felt as she prepared to step back into the public sphere. She had slept deeply, without fear tugging her awake, and as she dressed in the simple attire provided, she realized how unfamiliar peace still felt, like a language she was only beginning to understand. Attendants informed her that the council had reconvened for the formal acknowledgement of the Alpha King's decree, and though her stomach tightened at the thought of returning to the hall, it was no longer dread that guided her steps, but resolve. She walked beside Dominic Blackwood as they entered the chamber, the atmosphere shifting immediately, conversations quieting, eyes turning, not with suspicion this time, but with recognition, because the image of the rejected Omega standing under the Alpha King's protection had already reshaped perception overnight. Dominic moved with measured authority, guiding the proceedings with clarity, and when he spoke of Elena, it was not to recount her plea, but to affirm her status, stating plainly that she stood under his name and his law until her safety was no longer in question. The words were formal, yet they carried a deeply personal weight. Elena stood beside him, shoulders squared, meeting the gaze of those who watched her now. She felt the absence of fear where it used to live, replaced by a steady confidence she had earned. Ryan Cole was present, seated among others, his posture stiff, his earlier entitlement reduced to uneasy restraint. Dominic addressed him directly, not to shame, but to establish boundaries publicly, reinforcing that Elena's autonomy was not negotiable, that any future interaction would occur only under clear consent and oversight. The declaration was firm, final, and delivered without hostility, which made it impossible to contest without exposing intent. A quiet murmur followed, not dissent, but acknowledgement, because the rules had been spoken aloud, clearly, and everyone understood them. Elena felt the weight of that moment settle. This was not just protection in theory, it was protection witnessed, validated, woven into the collective understanding of the pack. As the council accepted the decree, recording it as law, Elena exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but the release profound. Dominic then turned to the assembly and spoke about responsibility, about how leadership was measured not by dominance, but by the willingness to intervene when silence enabled harm. His words were not accusatory, but instructive, and Elena sensed the ripple they created, challenging long-held beliefs without tearing the structure apart. When proceedings concluded, the council dispersed with a subdued respect, many offering Elena brief nods, small gestures that signaled a shift in how she was seen. She returned to the side of Dominic as they exited, and though he did not guide her hand or gesture possessively, his presence beside her was unmistakable, deliberate. Outside the chamber, Elena paused, absorbing the significance of what had just occurred. She had been defended not in secrecy, but in full view, her worth affirmed without qualification. Dominic spoke to her quietly, acknowledging her composure, reminding her that standing through that moment required courage, and Elena thanked him, her voice steady, sincere. She understood now that protection was not about being hidden away, but about being given space to exist without fear. As they walked onward through the keep, Elena felt something new take shape. Within her, a sense of belonging not rooted in obligation or bond, but in mutual respect. She did not know what the future held, whether it would bring further challenges or unexpected paths, but she knew this. She would no longer shrink to survive. She would stand, openly, honestly, and if needed, she would ask for help without shame, because she had learned that true strength did not come from enduring harm in silence, but from choosing to step into the light and allowing the right person to stand beside you. The days that followed unfolded with a gentler rhythm, one that allowed Elena to breathe between moments rather than brace herself against them. Life within the keep settled into something quietly predictable, and that predictability became its own kind of healing. She spent mornings in the inner gardens where stone paths curved through trimmed hedges and soft grass, the air carrying the faint scent of earth and leaves, a place where she could walk without being watched too closely, without having to measure every movement. She noticed how often Dominic passed through the same space at different hours, never intruding, never ignoring her presence either, simply acknowledging her with a nod or a brief exchange that felt respectful rather than rehearsed. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Elena began to relax around him. Their conversations remained simple at first, grounded in observation rather than confession, discussing the weather shifting toward early fall, the way the packlands prepared for seasonal changes, the small routines that kept the kingdom steady. And yet beneath those surface exchanges ran a current of understanding, because Dominic did not speak to her as someone he had saved, but as someone whose perspective mattered. He asked questions and listened to the answers without interruption, and that listening became the most unexpected gift of all. Elena found herself sharing pieces of her past, not because she was required to explain herself, but because she felt safe enough to do so. She spoke of learning to be quiet early, of how silence became a shield, and Dominic did not respond with judgment or pity, only acknowledgement. He understood restraint, the burden of expectation, the cost of leadership that left little room for vulnerability, and in that shared understanding, a quiet connection formed, not rushed, not claimed, but built on mutual respect. Elena noticed changes within herself too, the way she slept, more soundly. The way her shoulders no longer crept upward when footsteps echoed nearby. The way she laughed softly at small things without immediately checking who might overhear. One afternoon, as they stood overlooking the courtyard, watching younger pack members train at a distance, Dominic spoke about the responsibility of shaping a future where protection did not depend on status, where asking for help was not seen as weakness. And Elena realized then that what he had done for her was part of a larger intention, not an exception, but a standard he meant to uphold. That realization filled her with a quiet pride, not in herself, but in the choice she had made to step forward when it mattered. Later that evening, as dusk settled and lanterns were lit along the walkways, Elena paused near the edge of the courtyard, the sky shifting into deep blues and soft golds. Dominic joined her, standing at a respectful distance, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence between them. Comfortable, shared, Elena finally broke it, thanking him again, not just for protection, but for seeing her as capable of reclaiming her life. Dominic met her gaze and responded simply, stating that strength often revealed itself through honesty, and that she had shown more courage than many who never needed to kneel. The words settled deeply, affirming something she was only beginning to believe about herself. As the evening cooled, Elena returned to her chambers with a sense of calm she had never known. She understood that her story was still unfolding, that healing was not immediate or complete, but she also understood that she was no longer defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by the choices she made now, by the boundaries she upheld, by the quiet confidence growing within her. And as she prepared for rest, she felt a gentle certainty take root. Whatever the future held, she would meet it standing, supported not by fear or obligation, but by trust, respect, and the knowledge that she was no longer alone. The announcement came at twilight, when the keep gathered for the weekly address, lanterns glowing softly as voices hushed in anticipation. Elena stood among the assembled, no longer hidden at the edges, her posture calm, her presence acknowledged. Dominic Blackwood stepped forward with the same measured authority he always carried, yet there was a warmth beneath it now, a deliberate clarity meant to reach everyone listening. He spoke of the recent decree not as a correction, but as a commitment, reaffirming that protection was a right grounded in dignity, not leverage, and that the laws of the pack would reflect that truth moving forward. His gaze swept the crowd, and then settled briefly on Elena, not to single her out, but to anchor the message in lived experience. He stated that from this moment on, Elena Hart stood under his name and his law, not as possession, not as obligation, but as recognition of her courage and her autonomy. The words landed quietly and decisively, and the gathering responded not with shock, but with acceptance, a collective understanding that the Alpha King had drawn a line that would not be crossed. Elena felt the meaning of it settle through her body, steady and grounding, as if the world itself had shifted to meet her where she stood. After the address, the crowd dispersed into gentle conversation, the night air cool against skin, and Elena found herself walking beside Dominic along the outer terrace, the stars beginning to appear above the packlands. She thanked him once more, not out of habit, but with a calm certainty, acknowledging that his choice had changed more than her circumstances. It had changed her sense of what was possible. Dominic listened, then replied that leadership was only meaningful when it created space for others to stand taller, and that her willingness to speak had given his authority purpose. They paused at the edge of the terrace, overlooking the land stretching into the distance, a future both familiar and newly open. Elena realized that what she felt was not dependence, but trust, the kind that grows slowly and sustains itself. She did not ask what came next, and he did not promise more than what was offered, because both understood that the strength of this moment lay in its honesty. As the evening deepened, Elena returned to her chambers with a sense of completion she had never known. The fear that once defined her now felt distant, replaced by a steady confidence rooted in self-respect. She prepared for rest, aware that tomorrow would bring new challenges and choices, but also aware that she would meet them on her own terms. Elsewhere in the keep, Dominic reflected on the path ahead, on the standard he had set, and on the Omega who had reminded him why power must be tempered with empathy. He understood that destiny did not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it arrived through a simple request spoken aloud, a decision made in public, a promise kept without expectation. And as the night settled over the Packlands, a quiet certainty took hold. This was not an ending, but a beginning, one defined by protection that did not demand silence, by strength that stood between harm and hope, and by two lives moving forward with respect, trust, and the shared belief that true authority is measured not by what it claims, but by what it safeguards.